Now here, in example 21, we see that the scores of a standard has a mean of 82 and a standard deviation of 3.6. Now, assuming a normal distribution, a student score of 91 will rank at what percentile? Now, we highlighted some of the keywords here, which is the mean, standard deviation, what kind of graph we talk about, normal distribution, and the point of interest. If we want to find out the percentile or point of interest is located at, we need to see how far that point is from the mean in terms of standard deviation. How many standard deviation is our point away from our mean? In order to do that, we're going to put our point 91 minus 82, which is our mean, and we're going to divide it by the standard deviation, which is 3.6. If we do that correctly, we see that we are 2.5 standard deviation away from the mean. If we look at our normal distribution graph, we see that every standard deviation gives us a percentile. How many standard deviation are we off? 2.5. So it means that we have 1 standard deviation, 2 standard deviation, and a half. Now, we gotta remember that when it comes to normal distribution is symmetric, so we also have to count the percentiles on the other side, 2 and a half. This area is the percentile that we're interested on. Now, so let's just add the percentiles there are in our graphs. So we have, I'm just gonna add the right side, and I'm going to multiply by 2 because we know it's symmetric. So we're going to get, if we add 1 standard deviation, we're going to get 34.13. That's 1 standard deviation. I need to add another standard deviation. For the second standard deviation, we're going to have 13.59. So this gives us 2 standard deviations. Let's multiply by 2 to get the other side, times 2. So we see right away that by 2 standard deviations, we got 95. We have 2.5 standard deviations, which means our point of interest is above 95 percentile, because by 2 standard deviations, we are already 95, which means that 2.5 standard deviation, it has to be above 95 percentile. Now, in example 24, they're asking us if the cosine of theta is equals to 34, then what is the cosine of 2 theta? Well, the strategy here is to find out what theta is. We're going to get our value. We're going to substitute it to to the expression we want to find the value of, and then we're going to get our answer. So let's find out, how do we solve for cosine, or how do we solve for theta? So we have cosine of theta equals 3/4. Now, to solve for theta, we find the inverse. Now, how do we get that? You gotta remember that to solve for theta, we multiply by the inverse to both sides so they can cancel out. So now we want to find out this. What is the inverse cosine of 3/4? So for that, use second cosine 3 divided by 4. So we see that theta is equal to 0.7227342,478. So now we have that cosine 2 times 0.72, which is abbreviated because I don't want to write the whole number. So we're going to have our original answer multiplied by times 2. So now we know that the inside have the cosine of 1.445. So let's find out the cosine of this. Now I'm going to press cosine, and I'll press second answer. Again, when I do that, the answer is going to be the number that we had on top, the number that we have calculated previously. We want our answer in fractions, so we're going to put math, fraction, and enter. So we see that our answer is 1 divided by 8. In example 23, they're giving us certain points, and they want us to find a statement that is true. If you look, we want to find out if the inverse of the functions are actual functions. Now, let's look at the function. Well, they use m. So now the function. Well, before we start solving, I want to point out that when they're giving us points, if x repeats, then we do not have a function. So now let's look at original. Look at the x values here. We see that none of the x values repeats. So we know that the original function, it is a function. So m is a function. So let's try to cancel some out. M is a function. We know that m is a function, so we can cancel out 3. And we can cancel out 4. Now, the idea is the inverse of function as well. How do we find out the inverse? Well, we gotta flip. We gotta flip points. Now, m is calculated this way, which means that the inverse is equal to, we're gonna flip points. If we have negative 1, 1, so the inverse is 1 comma negative 1. If we have 1, 1, then our inverse is 1, 1. And our region is negative 2, 4, so our inverse is gonna be 4, negative 2, 2, 4. So the inverse is 4, 2, negative 3, 9. So our inverse is 9, negative 3, 3, 9. So our inverse is 9, 3. So these are the points for the inverse. Now, notice here that there's an x point that repeats, which means that m is not a function. So we know that m is a function, and the inverse of n is not a function. So we see right away that example, or x, or option 2 is the correct option, since m is a function, and the inverse is not a function. Now, lastly, in example 24, we want to see if the following expression, what is that equal to? Well, first, whenever you take the square root of a negative number, you gotta remember the square root of negative 1, that is equal to the imaginary number I. So we take the square root of a negative number, so we can rewrite the following. So I square root of 180 x 16. Now, let's try to, we can break the square root into 2 parts. 180 x to 16. Because whenever you have a multiple inside the square root, you can take the square root individually. So this is what we have. Now, we are going to see if there's a way for us to rewrite the square root of 180. Square root of 180, we can rewrite as 36 times 5. Now, we got to remember that when we take the square root with an exponent, we can rewrite this. Remember, the square root of x is equal to x to the 1/2. Let's say the cube root of x is equal to x to the 1/3, and so on. We can rewrite a square root as an exponent, a fractional exponent. So we have the square root of x 16. So we have that x 16 divided by 2. So now we have I square root of 36 is 6, remaining 5 inside, times x 16 divided by 2, that's 8. Let's just rewrite our function. So we have that 6 x to the 8 I square root of 5, which we see our correct option is number 4.